Welcome to Centre for Global Higher Education. My name is David Mills, and it's 2 p.m. GMT in Oxford. We are celebrating our 383rd seminar for CGHE, which is a great set of resources now for us all to have and learn from. Today, I'm welcoming Nathwani, who is a researcher at Jisc, but particularly part of the Higher Education Statistics Agency, HEESA, and he'll be talking about graduate job quality in the UK. Is there a need to look beyond earnings and occupation type? So before I turn over to Tej, just a couple of housekeeping points. As normal, we are going to record this webinar, and we'll post the transcript and the recording online as soon as we can, probably tomorrow if we can. In addition, we will also post the audio as well. Just so you know what happens, we recommend you keep yourself muted during the talk, and you can turn your video on at the end to ask a question. Put your questions in the chat as Tej is coming to an end, and then I can invite you to come forward and ask your questions to Tej. And in the meantime, you speak of you, so you can see the slides and all the data that he's going to be showing us. And that's probably enough for me now. It's a really pleasure to welcome you, Tej. Thank you very much for coming to us to talk about HEESA, which I think is a really interesting and important source of data for us all to learn from. So it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen first, and then we'll get going. It's saying I cannot share my screen at the moment.
Yeah, I think, Chris, if you unshare the CG screen. That's it. Brilliant. That's good. All good.
And you should all be able to see my presentation now.
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So, hello everybody. My name's Tej. I'm from the Higher Education Statistics Agency. I'd like to thank Golo in particular for getting the ball rolling with organising this seminar. And I'm here today to present to you a new graduate job quality measure that we've been developing over the last sort of year or so. And the question we'll be looking at really is there a need to go beyond earnings and occupation type? So before we go into the meat of the presentation, I just wanted to give everybody a quick introduction into HEESA and what we do. So back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was a really rapid expansion in higher education in the UK. And this led to a call from policymakers for a more coherent approach to the collection and dissemination of statistics. So as a result of the Further on Higher Education Act of 1992, HEESA was set up to perform that function. So over the last 30 years, what we've done is we've collected data from all providers across the UK, stored that within our agency, and then produced a range of outputs on topics such as students, staff, graduates. And because these are official statistics, you have to abide by the code of practice that's set in place. And that means you have to ensure your statistics are relevant and valuable to your end user. You look to plug identified information gaps. And really, this is the key reason why we set up a research arm within the agency, because research and doing methodological papers allows us to produce or test new measures and eventually look to bring them through experimental statistics and into our official statistics outputs. And I'll talk a bit more about the role the code of practice has played in kind of, if you like, leading this research later on in the presentation. For kind of another analogy, the Office for National Statistics, you'll know, produces a lot of economic measures, things like inflation. And it will be left to the likes of the Bank of England or the Treasury to make decisions on how to use that information. And we're very similar for higher education. It's our duty to keep improving the statistics, but we then leave it to others to make decisions about how to use that data, essentially. So in terms of the aims and the roadmap, by the end of this presentation, what I hope to do is convince you that this new measure that we've developed on graduate job quality is a useful complement to existing indicators used to understand graduate outcomes. Now, for those of you familiar with the UK context, you'll be aware that we focus heavily on graduate earnings and also whether or not graduates in a professional or managerial role. And so to convince you of the value of this new measure, we're going to have to talk through the policy context and why earnings alone shouldn't be used to understand graduate outcomes. But also, it's always been assumed that professional and managerial roles are those where graduates are using their skills or that align with their career aspirations. But again, this is very much an assumption, and so we need to look at this from an empirical perspective. And we'll do that later on in this presentation. So in terms of the roadmap and how I aim to get to the objective, what we'll do is we'll start with a discussion of the international policy context. I'll then bring that into the UK perspective, and then we'll talk about what's going on in higher education. I'll then introduce the data set to you, which is known as graduate outcomes, and we'll then look into specifying the key research questions that I'll be tackling as part of the presentation. We'll then talk through methodology, results, and potential uses of the measure. And before I open up for questions, I'll just give some further information on how you can give feedback to us about what you'd like to see from either our survey or our statistics. So let's begin with the policy context. And as many of you will know, 40 or 50 years ago, when we were looking at labour markets across the globe, the focus was very much on objective measures. So things like earnings, the quantity of jobs available. Actually, if you look at my own field of economics, there was always a suspicion around subjective data, the concern being that it was not reliable. One of the first papers to really look at something like a subjective measure, such as job satisfaction, was by Richard Freeman in the American Economic Review. And in a paper in 1978, he highlighted that actually job satisfaction told us quite useful information about the kind of circumstances and quality of life of an individual. Nevertheless, 2 decades later, we were still very much focused on earnings and quantity of jobs and essentially objective measures. And then the International Labour Office highlighted that an objective for the coming millennium was to really look at providing decent work for all. And then, of course, less than a decade later, we saw the emergence of the financial crisis. And this again led to calls from policymakers and politicians as to, well, is the status quo way of looking at things really the right approach? And so some of you will know that Nicolas Sarkozy commissioned economists like Amartya Sen, Joseph Stiglitz to really look into how we measure economic and societal progress. And these economists, very much like Freeman, pointed out that actually we need to give more weight to non-monetary outcomes, subjective well-being, quality of work and life. And if you look at the most recent Sustainable Development Goals put forward by the United Nations, which also apply to countries like the UK, then they specify that actually decent work for all is a key objective. So, of course, with this increased focus on decent work, that has led to a lot of increased attention in the academic literature around, well, what do we mean by decent work and job quality? And the kind of consensus that seems to be emerging is one of where job quality is a complex concept. It's multifaceted, consisting of several components. And it really should be those aspects of work which relate to our well-being. Now, there's ongoing debate about exactly what the indicators should be and whether we should look at them from an individual perspective or aggregated. Those papers that focus on more individual aspects will look at things like autonomy, hours worked, your employment contract, alongside things like your pay. And when it comes to aggregate measures, aside from pay and benefits, they're looking very much at things like your interpersonal relationships at work. So things like your relationship with your line manager or your relationship with your peers. In the UK, many of you will know that policy is now increasingly devolved across the 4 nations. And when it comes to kind of this fair work and decent work agenda, Scotland was really much a leader in this. They set up the Scottish Fair Work Convention back in 2015. This acts as an independent advisory group to Scottish Government. And for those of you aware of the Scottish context, you'll see in their latest National Strategy for Economic Transformation that fair work's really a key aspect of that. And so in their framework, they've got fair work to consist of dimensions such as fulfillment, respect, security, and I'll come back to a few of these later on in the presentation. Wales followed similarly in 2019 with a report from their Fair Work Commission on what they saw as characterising fair work. But if you were to look at the UK context overall, really the change occurred when Theresa May commissioned Matthew Taylor to conduct a review of modern working practices. And that was very much in response to the changing ways in which we were working, for example, the growth of the gig economy. Now, when Matthew Taylor reported back and gave a set of recommendations, the vast majority of these were accepted. And one of these was saying, well, how do we measure job quality? So we need to identify suitable measures, put them into surveys, and then look to disseminate data on this on a regular basis so the public are aware of how things are changing in the labour market. And so shortly after that report, they set up a short-term working group called the Measuring Job Quality Working Group. And that was led by the Carnegie Trust and had people like the Office for National Statistics on the panel. They were tasked with coming up with what should be job quality indicators for the UK context. And they decided that there were 18 indicators covering 7 broad dimensions. And those 7 dimensions are appearing on your screen right now. But the key one we'll focus on for the rest of this presentation will be that 4th one, the job design and nature of work. And that encompasses things like your skills use, your autonomy in the workplace, your career opportunities, and whether work is meaningful and provides you with a sense of purpose. Now, when it comes to higher education and graduate outcomes, many of you will know that in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a real growth in interest in graduate outcomes, and this has taken place for a variety of reasons. The growing number of graduates entering the labour market has led to interest within academia around whether graduates are doing essentially graduate type jobs. Is there overqualification? And there's a growing literature on that within the academic sphere. From a policy perspective, we've seen a lot of changes in the way higher education runs. For example, in England, we now have a regulator who will look at things like graduate outcomes as part of its assessments. And there's also, of course, the increased tuition fees paid by students from England. So they're now over £9,000. And so that's regularly led to question marks over the value of higher education and hence interest in what graduates are earning shortly after they leave their course. We've also seen in England and in the other nations the emergence of the longitudinal education outcomes data set. So this is basically collected by linking together administrative records relating to benefits, tax, and your education. And so governments can now track the earnings of graduates and non-graduates across the lifespan. The other key kind of measure that we use, whether or not graduates are in professional managerial roles, of course, is not a job quality indicator in itself. So the real key job quality indicator we focused on is earnings. And I'll come back to that issue later on in the presentation. But perhaps what's also quite interesting is that when you look at what graduates are asking for, students from their education, they talk about actually the fact that it's not just higher earnings that they're looking for. They want careers which allow them to make impact, which allow them to use their skills, and which really allow them to align with their career aspirations. And if you were to look at some of the strategic objective of policymakers, funding bodies across the UK, as you can see from these italic sentences, you've got a real focus on fulfillment. So that obviously leads to question marks on, well, what do we mean by fulfillment? And that's where you can bring back the Scottish Fair Work Convention framework, because in there they talk about fulfillment essentially being related to whether your work provides a sense of purpose, uses your skills, and gives you the chance to train and develop. So these are very similar to that job design and nature of work aspect put forward by the UK group looking at job quality indicators for the UK. So I talked earlier about how I'd come back to HEESA's role and the Code of Practice for Statistics. So I said that one of our duties is to try and plug identified information gaps through research. So there's an interest from graduates in finding fulfilling careers, and there's an interest from policymakers and funding bodies that they want their graduates to find fulfilling lives and careers. But we don't actually have any data that tells us the extent to which graduates find fulfilling work. So from our point of view, this is a gap in the literature, in the statistics, and somewhere where our research can help to really create something new and potentially improve our official statistics on higher education. And that was very much the reason and motivation behind this work. So when we come to the data set, for those of you who are familiar with HEESA data, we used to collect something known as the destination of leavers of higher education. We ran this survey for about 15 to 20 years on an annual basis, and it went through a major review in the mid-2010s. And the reason was really to try and ensure that the survey remained relevant and valuable to our stakeholders. So as I say, there's growing interest in subjective outcomes and changes in what policy interests were really kind of key in society. So what that led to was the development of a new survey called Graduate Outcomes. And this was firstly run for those who graduated in 2017-18. In terms of some of the key differences between the two surveys, both continue to ask questions on things like your main activity after graduation, what kind of job you're doing if you are in work, and your earnings. The Graduate Outcomes Survey takes place at 15 months compared to 6 months with the destination of leavers of higher education. And the real difference in terms of the questions is that we now ask questions on subjective well-being. There are 4 questions that align with what's generally asked by the likes of the Office for National Statistics. And I'll come back to some of these later on in the presentation. And also we ask graduates about their perceptions of their employment in what's known as the Graduate Voice section. So with the Graduate Voice section, we ask these 3 questions. And essentially they're Likert type questions where we ask graduates, to what extent do you agree or disagree with these statements? And as you can see from these 3 statements, they are very similar to the fulfillment aspect from the Scottish Fair Work Convention or the job design and nature of work if you're thinking about the UK-wide context. So let's now think about the key research questions we want to answer. But before I go into that, I want to just talk a bit about earnings. So some people might say, well, it might be perfectly reasonable just to focus on earnings if earnings are a good proxy for your non-monetary outcomes. And so when we looked at earnings and well-being in our graduate outcomes data set, what we saw was this pattern. So up to around £24,000, you see that higher earnings are generally associated with greater well-being. After that point, there's a leveling off. There's no real clear relationship between more earnings and well-being. And although I've provided changes in absolute earnings on the x-axis here, in our main paper on our website, we also look at percentage changes, and you see a very similar pattern. Now, it could be that this pattern is due to the fact that we're looking at graduates quite soon after graduation, so around the age of 23 or 24. And there is some evidence in the literature that the pattern between income and well-being can vary by your age group. So that could be the reason why we don't see a very clear pattern between earnings and well-being. Nevertheless, what this suggests is that actually monetary outcomes for graduates might not necessarily give us a good indication of their non-monetary outcomes. And of course, when you think about earlier where we talked about job quality indicators having to be correlated with well-being, there isn't a very clear correlation at the moment between graduate earnings and their well-being. So as I say, just going on from that previous slide, we know from the work of the likes of Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz that we can't just assess progress based on monetary outcomes. And we've also shown here now that actually earnings don't necessarily proxy for non-monetary outcomes in the case of recent graduates. Now, if you were to look at documents by the likes of the Department for Education on the professional and managerial occupation marker, you'll see that they talk about these being the types of roles that align with graduate career aspirations and skills use. Now, that's always been an assumption. To the best of my knowledge, no one's actually looked at that empirically. And these new graduate voice questions allow us to really say, well, is that the case based on what graduates are telling us? So that's going to be something we're going to look into later on in the presentation. The final thing to note before I highlight the 3 research questions is that the Measuring Job Quality Working Group suggested that we should try and create composite measures. So as I said earlier, each of these 7 dimensions has 3 or 4 indicators within them. And so you've got 18 indicators. Now, if you present 18 indicators to the general public, that's a lot of information. So to really try and understand the key trends can be quite difficult. So the Measuring Job Quality Working Group suggested create 7 indicators relating to those 7 dimensions. So you're distilling what is quite a large amount of information into something that's hopefully more digestible to both analysts and non-analysts. So the research questions that we're going to tackle are, can we create a composite measure for this job design and nature of work component, given we're asking questions that are related to that aspect in graduate outcomes? Given the definition and what we expect of job quality, how is that correlated well-being? And what is the relationship between this measure and occupation type? So the sample we're going to use is the graduate outcomes data for the first 2 years of collection. We're really focusing on UK domicile graduates who were working in the UK, paid work for an employer, and who answered all of those 3 graduate voice statements. And as you can see, the sample size we're working with is very large. So the creation of a composite measure basically involves 3 stages. We're going to have to ask ourselves, well, what assumptions do we make about the 3 statements? And I'll come back to that shortly. And what statistical evidence is there to suggest that these 3 variables are all part of the same concept? In our case, the job design and nature of work. And then finally, can the statements be reduced into a single dimension? So this image is actually taken from a paper by Kaiser and Vendrick, both of who work at the University of Oxford. So the paper's called Happy Transformations, and it's in my references to the paper I've published on the website. And what we're going to look at here is particularly panel A. But before I do so, let's just think about what the variable is. So you saw earlier that the graduate voice questions were Likert questions that range from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Now, generally speaking, the assumption is that we know that strongly disagree is worse than disagree, but we can't be sure that the gap between strongly disagree and disagree is the same as the gap between agree and strongly agree. So we call this kind of data ordinal data. For those of you who are familiar with the work of the Office for National Statistics, they produce data on well-being. And one of the variables they produce data on is happiness. So the question on happiness is basically on a scale of 0 to 10, how happy were you yesterday? And where 0 is extremely unhappy and 10 is extremely happy. Now, if someone was to give a rating of 4 and another person was to give a rating of 8, what we know from that data is that the person who rates themselves as 8 is happier than the person who rates themselves as 4. What you cannot just straight away assume is that the person is twice as happy, because we can't be sure that a rating of 4, the gap between, say, 4 and 5 is the same as the gap between 7 and 8. Now, if you were to look at the Office for National Statistics outputs, you'll see they produce mean happiness scores. So the reason they do this is they basically said, okay, let's assume the data is ordinal and run our analysis on that basis. But let's also run an analysis based on the fact that there is equidistance between the values between 0 and 10. So essentially, it's like continuous data. And when they did this, they saw, well, actually, the conclusions we generally reach are very similar when you have that number of basically ranking options or items, because you've got an 11-point scale. So what they've said is, well, given these 2 results are quite similar and the continuous nature of the data is easier to interpret, we'll report it as a continuous variable, given there's no real statistical difference. What I want to show here is actually experiments that look at how people treat value labels, and that's the Van Praag Panel A discussion. So what Van Praag did with his participants was he said, okay, we've got 5 value labels in the very similar way to what we have in graduate outcomes. Please give a ranking between 1 and 1,000 and assign them a value So for example, very bad will be assigned a value between 1 and 1,000, and the same for the other 4 value labels. And then he ran a second experiment saying, okay, draw a line which kind of you believe represents that value label of a length of your choosing. And that's why you have the line experiment label at the bottom there. Essentially, what you see from the chart is that 45-degree line would be linearity, and the 2 lines for the 2 experiments are not very far off being linear. So the experimental evidence suggests that actually people treat these value labels in a linear fashion. So if we were to assign values of 1 to 5 to our strongly disagree to strongly agree in the graduate voice questions, based on the experiments of Van Praag, these do not seem unreasonable assumptions to make. And so we'll continue using these questions, as you'll see, as essentially continuous data ranging from 1 to 5. Moving on to the second part of developing a composite measure, this is where you bring in Cronbach's alpha. And essentially what this is designed to do is tell us, are these 3 items part of the same underlying concept? Now, if you were to look at the formula for Cronbach's alpha, you'll see on the numerator, you have essentially terms relating to the number of items and essentially the average covariance between the items. Now, a higher covariance or a stronger correlation between these items would suggest they're all part of the same concept. Now, this is an indicative statistical analysis. So generally in the literature, if you see people say, well, if you get a value above 0.7, you can assume that it is part of the same underlying concept. And we get a value of 0.83, and this doesn't change if we just do the analysis with the whole sample or if we vary it by academic year. So this provides some evidence in support of that theoretical framework put forward by the likes of the Scottish Fair Work Convention and also the Measuring Job Quality Working Group, that actually these aspects of work are all part of the same underlying concept. And then finally, the last question we ask is, well, can we reduce this into a single composite measure? Now, when you're working with continuous data, the most common method used is exploratory factor analysis. And when we ran this analysis, what we found was, yes, there was evidence to suggest one factor could result from these 3 items. And within that factor, your 3 items would essentially be weighted quite equally. But what that means is that you're not going to get 2 dissimilar results from an exploratory factor analysis as one where you just take a mean of the 3 questions. So you take 1 to 5 for each of the 3 questions and you take an average. Given our desire to report this into the public domain, of course, if you have an option between choosing a simpler approach or a more complex approach, the simpler one is preferred so that you can communicate your statistics to both analysts and non-analysts. And so the kind of key conclusion from that analysis was, yes, you can create a single composite measure. And it does seem to, the theory does seem to kind of be aligned with the empirical evidence. And so our composite measure is formed from these 3 variables and will be continuous and range from a value of 1 to 5. Then coming on to how it correlates with well-being. So we're very lucky in graduate outcomes, and this is the only survey I know which has both the graduate voice questions and questions on well-being, that we can actually empirically examine whether these job quality measures are correlated with well-being. And so I've plotted the data here. And what you see is that for all 3 well-being measures that we look at, so happiness and life evaluation measures, there's a linear correlation and a positive correlation. So again, this provides support that these job quality measures do correlate with well-being in the way we'd expect. What I think is quite interesting about the chart is that the steepness of the curve is essentially stronger for the life evaluation measures than the happiness measure. So there's a paper by John Helliwell back in the early 2010s, which he basically hypothesized that our present emotions, so something like our happiness, is more influenced by our short-term life conditions, for example, the day of the week, whereas our life evaluations are more likely to be influenced by our economic and social circumstances, for example, our work. Now, given we're focusing in on work here, we'd expect a stronger correlation with those life evaluation measures. And that's indeed what we see through the data. So now coming to that question around occupation type. So we've already talked earlier about how we can't just rely on earnings to understand both monetary and non-monetary outcomes. And actually, earnings aren't correlated with well-being in the way we might have expected, at least not for young graduates. Now let's look at the other key measure used often in assessing graduate outcomes, which is occupation type. And let's plot it with our composite measure. So here's that chart, dot plot. And on the face of it, you think, well, okay, the highest scores are amongst those in professional managerial roles. So the long-term assumption being held might not be an unrealistic assumption. But then let's think a bit more deeply about this topic. So when it comes to the job quality indicators, we have skills use in those job quality indicators. What we don't have is educational mismatch, which is defined as essentially whether your qualifications were required for the role. In the case of the job quality indicators, underemployment is more focusing on whether actual hours worked defer to your preferred hours worked. Now, in the literature, we see that for the UK at least, there's a strong correlation between your educational mismatch and skills mismatch, which is a part of that composite measure. Now, in the graduate outcomes survey, we asked graduates their views on whether they required their qualification for their job. So we'll ask them about the qualification, the subject, or whether it's just an advantage. And what I did is I created a binary marker saying, well, let's look at those graduates who said they require their qualification in some form, for whom is advantage, and for those who said, actually, I didn't require it at all. And then let's plot that data by occupation type. The yellow highlight is because it's quite interesting, the sizable proportion of managerial roles where graduates are saying, well, actually, I didn't even require my qualification. And also the sizable proportion of roles within administrative positions or skilled trades where graduates are saying, actually, my qualification was required or was actually beneficial in some way. And given there's academic evidence to suggest there's a correlation between education and skills use, we looked at splitting our first chart by this binary marker. And this is what you see in the data. So what's quite interesting here is that almost 40% of managers who said their qualifications weren't required report lower fair work scores than almost as half of graduates in, say, skilled trades or administrative roles, where they say, actually, yeah, my qualification was either required or was advantageous to my role. Overall, the conclusion from this analysis is actually that assumption we're making around professional managerial roles aligning with career aspirations and skills use, both of which are key parts of our composite measure, seems to be too strong an assumption, essentially. And so hopefully overall what you've seen is that actually this measure can add further knowledge on and understanding to graduate outcomes alongside existing measures like earnings and occupation type. And so in this final section, let's think about how the composite measure might be used by some of our key stakeholders. So many of you will be aware that when we hear discussion about the value of HE, apart from kind of the overall perspective, you often hear analysis by institution type or by subject area. And many of you will be aware that economics and medicine are generally seen as the highest earning professions. But when you were to plot the data for subject area in our composite measure, economics comes far lower down in terms of ranking by subject. As you can see at the top of the list is generally more vocational subjects like medicine and dentistry or education. So from a kind of student perspective, having this sort of information would also highlight some of the trade-offs that can occur in the labor market. You may find particularly well paid jobs, but they might not necessarily be as meaningful or use your skills in the same way as other professions where pay might not be as high. For example, subjects allied to medicine, where you might have nurses who are paid less, but who might report higher scores in terms of meaning and purpose of their jobs. And a few years ago, researchers at LSE, so the likes of Richard Layard, wrote a paper looking at inequalities in the labour market and seeing whether the disparities were greater when you consider non-monetary outcomes. And their conclusion was that actually there were greater disparities when you introduced an analysis of non-monetary outcomes. And so whilst policies focused heavily on things like the gender pay gap or the ethnicity pay gap, actually it was also important to look at non-monetary outcomes too. In the graduate labour market, there is some research suggesting there are no gaps in earnings by ethnicity once we control for various factors like work characteristics. When we look to this for our job design and nature of work measure, you see that there are raw differences in the score by ethnicity. And when we looked at controlling for various factors, actually the significant gaps did remain. So there was further evidence here to support the findings of the likes of Clark and Layard, who did that study for LSE. So before we move into the question section, I thought it'd just be useful just to note that we're always looking for feedback on our statistics and what people would like from our official statistics, but also what you'd like us to collect on graduate outcomes so that we can support research in this area. So if you have any particular questions or ideas that you think might be useful to include in graduate outcomes and the reasons for this, we'd always encourage you to submit your thoughts to us at the below address, and then we can take that into consideration when we go through the review of the survey. So that concludes the presentation. I've just provided some links here to where our research is located and if you want to sign up to our mailing list. But yeah, I'm now happy to move into the question section. Thank you very much.
Great, Tej. That's fascinating, really. And you've thrown some real sort of cats into the pigeons around human capital theory in relationship to sort of measuring useful degrees and useful jobs. Well, please post questions in the chat, everyone. Can I ask an initial question though, which is your analysis has this moment where you ask graduates about whether they think they needed their degree or not. And you treat that as a regularly sort of somewhat objective assessment of their degreeness. Isn't that also a subjective assessment, such that if you're in a management role, you might think, well, I didn't need my classics degree for this, but actually you might have benefited enormously from the networks or the cultural capital you built up from doing that classics degree.
Yeah, so the question is actually subjective. So it's asking graduates their perceptions of whether they require their qualification. It would be interesting to see the employer perspective, if you like, whether as well. So we're looking at the graduate perspective. I think future research could also look at the employer perspective, saying, yes, this job, we mandated a degree or a particular subject type.
That's really interesting. So putting those different perspectives on that into dialogue would be brilliant. Okay, Golo, you've got a question. Do you want to come forward and ask it?
Hi, Tash. Good to see you. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, great stuff. And it's fantastic that HEESA is putting this on sort of job quality on the agenda and in graduate outcome research. My question is more sort of about the last things that you talked about, how stakeholders could use this. My question is specific: how could policymakers use these insights when discussing degree value? My impression is that that's mostly about, well, there are some graduates who are not going to pay back their loans, and how much does it then matter whether it's a good or bad job?
So I think it's very much around going back to where I said about objectives for graduates and policymakers. So policymakers or funding bodies are saying one of the key aims is to ensure graduates have fulfilling lives. And actually these job quality aspects are very much related to fulfillment. We know that graduates themselves are not just interested in the earnings that they get from their degree. And actually yesterday, you'll have seen the response regarding the kind of issues regarding the OFS and the House of Lords inquiry, and they said, that even in that document, they highlighted that we need to look beyond just earnings and the kind of narrow perspective. We need to look at these wider value of higher education. So these kind of statistics are very much there to try and give us a wider perspective on what value higher education is providing both to the graduate, but also wider society. So I think going back to that issue when I talked about students, often students only get given information on this is how much you could earn. But then you might not go for a subject where even if you don't earn as much, it might provide you with a lot more fulfillment. Economics being the classic example, it seems that you earn a lot, but your fulfillment's not quite there. So yeah, it highlights the trade-offs I get for students there.
That's really interesting. Can I push you a bit further then, Tej, on that, in terms of what more HEESA could do? I mean, you're collecting this at 15 months. Could you collect it at 3 years? Could you, I mean, what are the limits in terms of your finances for doing this sort of much richer, deeper, longer type of research?
So I think that very much depends. Again, going back to feedback, we very rarely we always ask for feedback, but we don't get so much. So if we get a lot of customers coming to us and saying, look, we really value this, and this is really important for the sector, then that gives us a case to say, well, yeah, we need to look into essentially what we need to prioritize. So I think that's where the issue comes. If we get more feedback and understand where people's priorities lie, we can then make decisions about, do we run a follow-up survey? So you'll know that we used to run the longitudinal destinations where we used to track people at 3.5 years as well. And if people think that's valuable to do again, getting that feedback and having it on record would be very useful.
Interesting. Are there other questions? Are there other comments in the audience? You obviously impressed them all with your data sets. So I thought those graphs were really interesting on the well-being.
I have one coming through, David. If you can wait for the typing, or I can do it orally.
Okay, go for it, Ian. It's all yours.
Okay. I was interested in some things that weren't there that I thought might affect. So that happiness, for instance, I think may very much depend on whether, are you part of a team? Do you work in isolation? Are you self-employed? Issues like that. I don't know whether you're going to explore those. And I was interested in gender. I don't think it was there, but it came out in the pattern for those in needing a qualification and working in care, where they were away from the distribution of most of the other classifications. So comment on those two issues, please, if you would.
Yep. So I haven't looked at the gender differences in the data, and that's something I could do as part of further research. So your point around happiness and things like working in a team. So I agree, and this goes back to the point around introducing new questions on job quality in the survey. So if you look at the labour force survey, they've introduced questions on line manager support, which is one of the questions advised by the Measuring Job Quality Working Group. And that could be something we could look to introduce in a future survey question if that's of real interest. So the benefit of having a question that's also in the labour force survey is that you get the coherence of statistics, and you can then compare. You've got a huge graduate sample with our survey, but then the labour force survey would also allow you to look at things like non-graduates. So again, it just goes back to giving us feedback where you think actually that could be a useful avenue for future work and something you could include in your survey. But I agree with the point you're saying. There could be other factors within the job that also drive the relationships with well-being.
Great. I hope that answers the question, Ian. Couple more questions coming in.
I think, sorry, I'm only a man, but I think women get their happiness from in different ways from men. That's my perception from my experience.
Yes. So you're only really assessing happiness in relationship to jobs, aren't you, rather than life? Yeah. Okay. So let's go on. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, and also someone's got their hand up. Mariette, do you want to come forward and ask a question?
Hello. Yes, sure. You talked about the mismatch, right? I assume it was horizontal mismatch when major was not matching education, or was it vertical mismatch when the position that they hold was not matching whatever they desired? Also had a question about the student population. Were those graduates from bachelor programs, or it also included graduates from PhD and more advanced program? And the last question I had was about fulfillment. Is it in essence job satisfaction, or it's something more comprehensive than that? Thank you.
So you might have to remind me of all three questions, because I might forget. But on the issue of the sample, we include both undergraduate and postgraduate. The majority of the sample will be undergraduate, with quite a lot of postgraduates being made up of postgraduate taught students. We do include PhD students, but that generally makes up around 3 to 4% of the population. It's quite small. In terms of mismatch, we're looking at whether, again, this is very much graduate perception, of whether they believe that either their qualification or their subject was required for the job. And then the third question, you'll have to remind me what the third question was.
Yes, I was asking about how you conceptualized fulfillment, because it's somewhat of a broad concept. So is it job satisfaction in essence, or it's much more than that?
So what we have to do is going back to our kind of function as a statistics agency, that kind of the conceptual framework was developed by the Scottish Fair Work Convention. And that's where they said fulfillment, from their point of view, was based on things like effective skills use, training and development, and sense of purpose. And we try and take other people's, if you like, the conceptual or theoretical framework and investigate it statistically. So again, the statistical analysis suggests they're all part of the same concept. And it's really up to you, kind of, when it comes to deciding the concept, that's not really a statistical judgment. That's more kind of, you have to make a judgment as to what that's picking up. So from the Scottish Fair Work Convention, that would be fulfillment. From the UK-wide perspective, that's the job design and nature of work.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much for those clarifications, Tej. James, you have a couple of questions about dealing with wellbeing, but also the changes in the labour market.
Yes, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. This is James. I'm joining from Kenya. There was an aspect where Tej mentioned some of the changes in the labor market, but I didn't hear some striking trends or major changes in the labor market. And if there are, what are the forces or the driving factors behind those changes in the labor market? And my last question is actually similar in a lot of ways to the question by the last speaker, especially on well-being. How does he assess well-being? And because that's seemingly a very elusive topic. So how does he assess well-being of these graduates? Thank you.
So firstly, how do we assess well-being? In the UK, the Office for National Statistics essentially came up with that framework. This was around a decade ago. And we have 4 areas that they cover. That's happiness, anxiety, life satisfaction, the extent to which you believe your life is worthwhile. In the main paper, we highlight what the 4 questions are, but essentially you'll get questions like, overall, how satisfied are you with life nowadays? And they'll be asked to rate their satisfaction on a scale of 0 to 10. There's a similar question for worthwhile. The question on, is it life worthwhile? Similar question for happiness, and a similar question for anxiety. So we're essentially trying to use the same framework that's been essentially agreed across the UK for assessing well-being. I see you say, is it in any way related to satisfaction? Do you mean life satisfaction or job satisfaction?
Job satisfaction.
Yeah, so the literature basically says you shouldn't create a variable called job satisfaction. When you look at job quality or job satisfaction, it's composed of so many different components, and that's why people often say look at a broad range of indicators as the Measuring Job Quality Working Group have, rather than try to condense it into a single job satisfaction variable. Actually, the advice of the Measuring Job Quality Working Group was trying to narrow it down to one variable was unlikely to tell you the full picture of job quality, so they kind of advise against looking at it in that form. that's why we try and form, in the longer term, the aim is to form 7 dimensions and ensure that they're correlated with well-being. And then you asked final question, I think it was to do with the labour market. Could you just repeat that question?
Yeah, the question was generally about your initial statements when you started. You looked a bit at some of the changing nature of the labour market, and I just wanted to get a grip of some of the major changes and what is behind, what are the driving forces behind those transformations in the labour market. Thank you.
Yep. So one of the key reasons Theresa May commissioned it was there was this growing concern over the gig economy, and people were working on what we call 0 hours contracts. They weren't guaranteed work. There was a lot of insecure work, low paid work. And given the growth and changes in technology and the ways we were working, that was really why this interest in job quality in the UK really took off around 2016-17.
Interesting. So less a profound sudden change and more just a recognition that that people that these issues of well-being and satisfaction were becoming more and more policy concerns.
Yeah, I mean, like I said at the start, people have looked at the analysis in an academic setting around the value of these subjective measures. And it's only in the last 10, 15 years we've really seen it take off. And this did, you know, things like the Great Recession or real changes in technology that have, if you like, driven a real change in the way we analyze job quality now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's and quite right. People are thinking, well, you know, am I in this for life? What sort of quality of life that's going to be? So yeah, no, it's an interesting policy shift, and I think you're well placed to do the research that actually pushes this policy debate into a different direction, which often has been an unhelpful debate, I think, around graduate jobs and, you know, and degree preparation. A couple more questions before we finish. Christian, you asked a question about inclusivity and diversity.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like how inclusivity and diversity can also be included in like gathering data about overall job satisfaction and happiness. I kind of mentioned how I know it like ties in a lot to the overall like environment of one's job, but how can this also like connect to diversity of staff and like representation and things like that?
It's a good question. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head whether there was any question directly in the Measuring Job Quality Working Group questions regarding this issue, and I'm not sure. I'll have to take a look after the presentation. But there are sections in the Measuring Job Quality Working Group's kind of framework where they talk about things like employee representation, about your relationships at work. And I think that may be where this the issue around inclusivity and diversity might fit. But I need to look back at the framework again.
Okay, and thank you, Tej. And Nikolai, you got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much for a very nice and interesting presentation. So just a couple of questions and comments. So I think the first one would be the time period which is covered by the analysis. And I'm thinking about the issue of comparability of data for doing trend analysis across different countries, sectors. You know, so obviously I'm thinking the kind of, you know, how we can use across, you know, kind of different time periods in different countries and different industries to make the data comparable. And my second question would be, I think, how it's again, I think, connected to the issue of comparability and how can we kind of compare such composite indicators with other indicators, such as, you know, you mentioned the earnings and others as well. If, for example, results are contradictory. So, for example, the results that we obtain while looking at the composite measures are saying one thing, and then traditional indicators such as earnings are saying different things. How can we try to accommodate different results and different perspectives? And that brings me to the idea of subjectivity. And I think I'm just trying to understand, you know, how and just moving into the from the data analysis into the more policy related work. And I think my question would be maybe how we can try to convince policymakers, to take into consideration subjective measures, such as, because obviously, these are really relevant and really useful, but I think just moving into how we convince the general public and the policymakers, which are used to traditional indicators such as the earnings, which are hard data, hard indicators, which can be really, I think, not more relevant, but they can be looked at as more reliable, I think, even if sometimes they are not reliable, but I think this is the general perception. And how can we convince the general public and the policymakers and the statisticians and the economists and people used to figures and numbers, how can we convince to have a broader and wider and more inclusive look, and to include such indicators into the kind of more streamlined kind of indicators across different different kind of measures.
Yeah, so picking up on that, the first point you make around policymakers and taking subjective well-being more into consideration. So in the UK, the kind of real shift occurred when in 2010, again, shortly after the recession, David Cameron essentially instructed the ONS to start collecting data on well-being and said, look, we can't no longer just focus on those financial indicators that you mentioned. So there was a shift really emerging at that point. I think the other thing is sometimes people dismiss the value of subjective data, but there are academic papers by the likes of Andrew Oswald who try to provide evidence that actually we need to give it, it is reliable. And I think trying to bring that to the forefront and saying, look, we shouldn't just dismiss subjective data would be very helpful. And I agree with your point around the reliability of earnings. Even if you have an administrative data set, as we do now with the longitudinal education outcomes, it still has its pitfalls. So we don't have things like working hours in that data set. So it's always going to have issues. So I think those would be my points on the issue around subjective well-being and policymaking. Comparability, I think even before we get to the stage of time and cross-cohort comparisons, I think we need to ensure that we try and ask questions, the same questions throughout different surveys. So for example, just from the UK context, if we can have the same questions as, say, the Labour Force survey, people can do analysis using graduates and other surveys and see what pictures are emerging. I think that also would apply in a more European context, where if we're asking the same questions, then that's the first thing we need to do even before we talk about time, because if the questions are all different, someone could dismiss the findings on the basis that, well, this question is picking up different information to that question. So I'm just trying to think, anything else that I've forgotten as part of your questions, or have I covered everything?
You've covered most of the, I think, the things which are really interesting. And I just want to kind of touch a bit more on what are the scenarios and what can we do if the results that we're getting from this kind of analysis and work is contradicting kind of, different kind of results that we get, that we're getting while applying different methodologies and while looking at different earnings. For example, if we get some kind of results saying that people earning more are more happy than people earning less, and I'm just oversimplifying things, but I'm just saying that, and if we're saying, if we're looking at different kind of scenarios saying different things, how can we try to kind of, integrate that into a wider kind of perspective, and how we can kind of try to corroborate different kind of results to be kind of meaningful for policymakers and analysts as well, and for the higher education sector in general.
So I think this comes back to your point about things like comparability, because essentially if you can have the same questions across different surveys, or data that's collected similarly across different surveys, and you start to get a coherent picture, that there's something going on there. Sometimes, going back to the point about earnings, sometimes you get self-reported earnings and you get data reported from employers. And if you can see consistency in what individuals are saying and what employers are saying, that there's a story emerging. So I think that would be one of the things to really focus on that perspective, trying to get questions across the surveys consistent, so we can see if a consistent pictures develop. Going back to my own the presentation today, that finding by income and well-being is a good example where you see something that you think, oh, that is not what I'd have expected. But again, we kind of hypothesize that there is some evidence suggesting that the pattern might vary by age. So really the next thing is, again, going back to the labour force survey, if we included those questions in there, you could analyse the age issue, because the labour force survey covers everyone from 20 to 60. We only cover those really from around 21 to 24. So I think that's the way to try and understand some of these contradictions, but also develop an evidence base that people can say, yeah, I'm more sure that these are definitely the patterns going on within society.
Brilliant. We've run out of time, I think, Tej. You've offered us a really excellent analysis, and I really hope the policymakers take some of these points forward. That, I mean, in some ways, subjective is to underplay the importance of this experiential, rich data, and how important that is for thinking differently about the jobs and life. So a virtual round of applause to you, Tej, for this great presentation. We're here next again on Thursday, the 7th of December, with another webinar on mobility experiences of international students in India. So you're most welcome to come and join us to that, but please also keep a lookout for all our future events and use our archive as well. Tej, thank you again very much. Really nice to meet you. Thank you all for coming.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.